Sarah Mitchell pulled her black Porsche into the driveway of her new home in Oakwood Estates. The car's engine made a quiet purr as she turned it off. She sat for a moment looking at the beautiful house she had just bought. After 15 years in the Navy, she finally had a place to call her own. The house was perfect. It had white walls, a red roof, and a big garage. The front yard had green grass and pretty flowers. Sarah smiled as she got out of her car. She had worked so hard for this moment. Every deployment, every long month away from home had been worth it. Sarah was a commander in the U.S. Navy. She had served her country all over the world. She had been to places most people only see in movies. She had led teams of sailors through difficult missions. She had earned the respect of everyone she worked with. But right now she just wanted to be a regular person in a quiet neighborhood. The Porsche was her pride and joy. She had saved money for 5 years to buy it. Every time she got paid, she put some money aside. She didn't buy expensive clothes or go on fancy trips. Instead, she dreamed about the day she could drive her own sports car. When she finally bought it, she felt like all her hard work had paid off. Sarah grabbed her bags from the car and walked to her front door. The neighborhood was very quiet. She could hear birds singing in the trees. Children were playing in a yard down the street. It felt peaceful after all the noise and stress of military life. As she unlocked her door, Sarah noticed a woman watching her from across the street. The woman was about 50 years old with short blonde hair. She wore a pink dress and held a small dog in her arms. The woman stared at Sarah's car for a long time. Then she looked at Sarah with a frown on her face. Sarah waved at the woman, trying to be friendly. But the woman just turned around and walked back into her house. Sarah thought this was strange, but she didn't worry about it. Some people were just shy with new neighbors. Inside her new house, Sarah felt happy. The rooms were big and bright. The kitchen had new appliances. The living room had large windows that let in lots of sunlight. She had bought some furniture, but most of her things were still in boxes. She would have plenty of time to unpack and make the house feel like home. Sarah spent the rest of the day moving boxes and setting up her bedroom. She hung up her Navy uniforms in the closet. She put pictures of her family and friends on the dresser. She placed her military awards and certificates on a shelf. These things reminded her of all the good times and challenges she had faced in her career. As the sun started to set, Sarah decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. She wanted to see what Oakwood Estates was really like. She had chosen this place because it seemed safe and quiet. The houses were all well kept. The streets were clean. There was a small park with a playground and walking trails. During her walk, Sarah met some of her neighbors. There was Mr. Johnson, an old man who was watering his flowers. He seemed very nice and welcomed Sarah to the neighborhood. There was Mrs. Chen, a young mother who was pushing her baby in a stroller. She smiled and said hello. There was also Tom, a man about Sarah's age who was washing his car. He asked about her Porsche and said it was a beautiful car. Everyone seemed friendly and normal. Sarah felt good about her choice to live here. She thought she would be happy in this neighborhood. But as she walked back to her house, Sarah saw the blonde woman from earlier. The woman was standing in her front yard, talking to another neighbor. They were both looking at Sarah's house and pointing at her car. When they saw Sarah coming, they stopped talking and went inside. Sarah found this behavior odd, but she tried not to think about it too much. Maybe they were just curious about the new person on their street. She had dealt with much bigger problems in the military. A few nosy neighbors were nothing compared to the challenges she had faced overseas. That night, Sarah made dinner and sat on her back porch. She called her sister to tell her about the new house. Her sister was excited and asked lots of questions about the neighborhood. Sarah told her about the nice neighbors she had met, but she didn't mention the strange woman who had been watching her. After the phone call, Sarah went to bed early. She was tired from all the moving and unpacking. As she lay in bed, she felt grateful for her new life. She had served her country well, and now she could enjoy the peace and quiet of civilian life. The next morning, Sarah woke up early. This was a habit from her military days. She made coffee and sat in her kitchen, looking out at her car in the driveway. The Porsche looked perfect in the morning sunlight. She was proud of how hard she had worked to afford it. Sarah decided to spend the day shopping for things she needed for her house. She wanted to buy some plants for her garden and some pictures for her walls. She also needed to find a good grocery store and a gym where she could work out. As she walked to her car, Sarah noticed a piece of paper under her windshield wipers. She pulled it out and looked at it. It was a letter on official-looking paper with a logo that said, Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. The letter was addressed to new resident and was signed by someone named Margaret Henderson, HOA president. Sarah read the letter carefully. It welcomed her to the neighborhood and explained some of the rules that all residents had to follow. Most of the rules seemed normal, like keeping yards clean and not making too much noise. But there was one part of the letter that made Sarah pause. It mentioned appropriate vehicle, standards, and maintaining neighborhood character. It said that all residents should consider whether their vehicles fit the upscale image of Oakwood Estates. Sarah read this part again. She wondered if this was about her Porsche. Was someone trying to tell her that her car wasn't good enough for this neighborhood? She looked at her car again. It was clean, expensive, and parked properly in her own driveway. She couldn't understand what the problem could be. Sarah folded the letter and put it in her pocket. She had a feeling that Margaret Henderson, whoever she was, might be the blonde woman who had been watching her yesterday. Something told her that this letter was just the beginning of her problems in Oakwood Estates. 3 days later, Sarah found another letter on her car. This one was different from the first. The paper was the same official HOA letterhead, but the message was not as friendly. The letter was titled, Friendly Neighborhood. Reminder, but the words inside were not friendly at all. Margaret Henderson had written that some residents were concerned about certain vehicles that might not match the neighborhood's high standards. The letter suggested that owners of flashy or inappropriate cars should think about storing them somewhere else. It mentioned that the HOA was committed to keeping property values high for everyone. Sarah read the letter twice. She was starting to get annoyed. Her Porsche was not flashy or inappropriate. It was a nice car that she had worked hard to buy. She had parked it in her own driveway, which was her right as a homeowner. She couldn't understand why anyone would have a problem with it. That afternoon, Sarah was in her garage organizing her tools when she heard footsteps in her driveway. She looked up and saw a woman walking toward her. It was the same blonde woman she had seen watching her on the first day. The woman carried a clipboard and wore a serious expression on her face. "Excuse me," the woman said in a loud voice. "Are you the new resident?" Sarah put down her tools and walked over. "Yes, I'm Sarah Mitchell. I just moved in a few days ago." The woman looked Sarah up and down, then stared at the Porsche. "I'm Margaret Henderson, president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. I believe you received my letters about neighborhood standards." Sarah nodded. "Yes, I got them, but I'm not sure what you're trying to tell me. My car meets all the requirements in the HOA rules." Margaret's face got red. "Well, technically yes, but we need to think about the bigger picture here. This is an upscale neighborhood. We have certain expectations about the image we present to the community." Sarah stayed calm, even though she was getting more annoyed. In the Navy, she had learned how to deal with difficult people. She knew that getting angry would not solve anything. "Mrs. Henderson, I've read all the HOA documents. My car is legally parked on my property. It's clean, quiet, and causes no problems for anyone." Margaret wrote something on her clipboard. "The issue isn't about legal requirements. It's about being a good neighbor. Some residents have expressed concerns that your vehicle sends the wrong message about our community." Sarah crossed her arms. "What kind of message does my car send?" Margaret looked uncomfortable. "Well, it's very flashy, and it's foreign-made. Many residents prefer to support American car companies. We believe that American-made vehicles better represent the values of our neighborhood." Sarah almost laughed. This woman clearly didn't know anything about her. "Mrs. Henderson, I've served in the U.S. Navy for 15 years. I think my commitment to American values is pretty clear. I bought this car with money I earned protecting our country." Margaret's face got even redder. "That's all very nice, but it doesn't change the fact that your car is causing problems. Several neighbors have complained to me about it." Sarah looked around the neighborhood. "Which neighbors? I'd like to talk to them myself." Margaret clutched her clipboard tighter. "I can't reveal the names of residents who come to me with concerns. That information is confidential. But I can tell you that the complaints are real and they're serious." Sarah had dealt with enough bureaucrats in the military to recognize when someone was lying. Margaret was trying to use fear and pressure to get her way. But Sarah was not easily intimidated. "Mrs. Henderson, I understand that you have a job to do as HOA president, but I also have rights as a homeowner. I've broken no rules and I won't be bullied into changing my behavior because of anonymous complaints." Margaret's voice got louder. Nobody is trying to bully anyone. I'm simply asking you to be considerate of your neighbors. Maybe you could park the car in your garage instead of the driveway, or perhaps you could consider trading it for something more appropriate. Sarah felt her patience running out. I park in my driveway because I want to. And I'm not trading my car because you don't like it. I saved for years to buy this car and I'm not giving it up to make you happy. Margaret wrote more notes on her clipboard. I see. Well, I hope you'll reconsider your position. The HOA has ways of encouraging residents to follow community standards. We can issue fines for violations. We can put liens on properties. We can make life very difficult for people who don't cooperate. Sarah stared at Margaret. This woman was actually threatening her. In the military, Sarah had faced down enemy soldiers in dangerous situations. She was not afraid of a small-town HOA president with a clipboard. Mrs. Henderson, are you threatening me? Margaret tried to look innocent. Of course not. I'm just explaining how the HOA operates. We have rules and procedures that we follow when residents don't comply with community standards. Sarah stepped closer to Margaret. Let me be very clear about something. I know my rights as a homeowner. I know the law. And I know when someone is trying to intimidate me. Your threats don't scare me and they won't work. Margaret backed up a step. She wasn't used to residents who stood up to her. Most people in the neighborhood were afraid of getting fined or having problems with the HOA. But Sarah was different. She wasn't afraid and she wasn't backing down. I think you're being very unreasonable, Margaret said. I'm trying to help you fit in with the community. But if you want to be difficult, that's your choice. Sarah shook her head. I'm not being difficult. I'm being a homeowner who knows her rights. I suggest you go back and read the HOA rules again. You'll find that I'm in full compliance with every single one of them. Margaret looked frustrated. She had expected Sarah to be like the other residents who usually gave in to her demands. Most people wanted to avoid trouble with the HOA, so they would compromise or give in completely. But Sarah was not like most people. We'll see about that, Margaret said. I'll be reviewing your situation very carefully. And I'll be watching to make sure you don't violate any other community standards. Sarah smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. You do that, Mrs. Henderson. And while you're watching, remember that I'll be watching too. I'll be paying very close attention to how you do your job as HOA president. Margaret didn't like the sound of that. She turned around and walked away quickly, but not before giving Sarah's Porsche one more angry look. After Margaret left, Sarah went back into her garage. She was angry, but she was also determined. She had faced much bigger challenges than Margaret Henderson. She had commanded ships and led teams of sailors through dangerous missions. She was not going to be defeated by a neighborhood bully with a clipboard. Sarah decided to do some research. She wanted to learn everything she could about the HOA rules and her rights as a homeowner. She also wanted to find out more about Margaret Henderson and how she operated. If Margaret wanted a fight, Sarah was ready to give her one. Margaret Henderson was not happy. She had been the HOA president for 6 years, and no one had ever challenged her authority like Sarah Mitchell had. Most residents were afraid of her. They did what she told them to do without asking questions. But this new woman was different, and Margaret didn't like it at all. The next morning, Margaret was back. Sarah was drinking coffee on her front porch when she saw Margaret walking around her car with a measuring tape and a camera. Margaret was taking pictures of the car from every angle and writing notes on her clipboard. Sarah walked over to see what Margaret was doing. Can I help you with something, Mrs. Henderson? Margaret didn't look up from her measuring. I'm conducting an official HOA inspection. I have the right to check for violations of community standards. Sarah watched as Margaret measured the distance between her car and the curb. What exactly are you looking for? Margaret stood up and showed Sarah her clipboard. According to HOA rules, all vehicles must be parked at least 18 inches from the curb. Your car is only 15 inches away. That's a violation. Sarah looked at the space between her car and the curb. Mrs. Henderson, the rule says vehicles should be parked a reasonable distance from the curb. It doesn't specify an exact measurement. Margaret pointed to her clipboard. I've been interpreting the rules for 6 years. 18 inches is the standard I use for all residents. Sarah knew this was nonsense, but she decided not to argue. Instead, she moved her car 3 inches farther from the curb. There, is that better? Margaret frowned. She had hoped that Sarah would refuse to move the car, which would give her a reason to issue a fine. That solves the parking problem, but there are other issues we need to discuss. Such as, Margaret flipped through the pages on her clipboard. Noise violations. Yesterday at 8:30 in the morning, you washed your car in your driveway. The sound of water running disturbed several neighbors. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. I washed my car for 10 minutes. It was 8:30 in the morning on a Saturday. That's a perfectly reasonable time to wash a car. Margaret shook her head. The HOA noise policy states that residents should avoid activities that might disturb their neighbors. Car washing creates noise from water spraying and scrubbing. It's inconsiderate. Sarah was getting tired of this game. Mrs. Henderson, you're making up rules that don't exist. There's nothing in the HOA documents about car washing being a noise violation. Margaret wrote something else on her clipboard. I'm the president of this HOA, and I have the authority to interpret the rules as I see fit. If you don't like my interpretation, you can file a complaint with the board. Sarah decided to take Margaret's advice. That afternoon, she called the HOA office and asked to speak to someone about filing a complaint against the president. The woman who answered the phone seemed nervous. What kind of complaint? The woman asked. I want to file a complaint about Margaret Henderson's behavior and her interpretation of HOA rules. There was a long pause. Well, Mrs. Henderson is the president, so she handles all complaints. You would need to talk to her about any concerns. Sarah couldn't believe it. You're telling me that the only person I can complain to about the president is the president herself? That's how our system works, the woman said quietly. Mrs. Henderson has been doing this job for a long time. She knows what she's doing. Sarah hung up the phone feeling frustrated. It was clear that Margaret had set up the HOA to protect herself from any criticism. But Sarah was not giving up. She decided to talk to her neighbors to learn more about how Margaret operated. The next day, Sarah visited Mr. Johnson, the elderly man she had met on her first walk. He was working in his garden when she approached him. Hi, Mr. Johnson. I wanted to ask you about the HOA. Have you ever had any problems with Mrs. Henderson? Mr. Johnson looked around nervously as if he was afraid someone might hear him. Why do you ask? Sarah explained what had been happening with Margaret and her car. Mr. Johnson's face got sad as he listened. She did the same thing to the family who lived in your house before you, he said quietly. They had a nice red sports car. Mrs. Henderson said it was too flashy for the neighborhood. She kept giving them tickets and fines until they finally sold the car and bought a boring gray sedan. Sarah was shocked. She actually forced them to sell their car? Mr. Johnson nodded. That wasn't the worst of it. She said their car was lowering property values for everyone. She convinced other neighbors to complain about them. Eventually, they got so tired of the harassment that they moved away. Why doesn't anyone stand up to her? Mr. Johnson looked around again. Because she makes life miserable for anyone who crosses her. She'll find violations that don't exist. She'll fine you for every little thing. She'll turn your neighbors against you. Most people just do what she wants to avoid the trouble. Sarah felt angry. Margaret was nothing more than a neighborhood bully who used her position to control people. Has anyone ever tried to remove her from office? A few people have tried over the years, Mr. Johnson said. But she controls the board, and she controls the voting process. She always finds a way to stay in power. That evening, Sarah visited Mrs. Chen, the young mother with the baby. Mrs. Chen was more willing to talk than Mr. Johnson, but her story was just as disturbing. Mrs. Henderson told us our car was too small for the neighborhood, Mrs. Chen said. She said that compact cars made the neighborhood look cheap. She wanted us to buy a bigger, more expensive car. Did you do it? Mrs. Chen shook her head. We couldn't afford a bigger car, so she started fining us for other things. She said our flower pots were the wrong color. She said our mailbox was positioned incorrectly. She said our house numbers were too small. We ended up paying hundreds of dollars in fines for things that weren't even real violations. Sarah was getting a clear picture of how Margaret operated. She targeted people with things she didn't like, then made up violations to harass them until they gave in to her demands. The next morning, Sarah found another letter on her car. This one was much more threatening than the previous ones. Margaret had written a formal violation notice charging Sarah with failure to maintain appropriate vehicle standards and repeated disregard for community noise policies. The letter listed a fine of $200 and threatened additional penalties if Sarah didn't correct the violations immediately. It also mentioned that continued non-compliance could result in legal action and liens against her property. Sarah read the letter twice, then laughed. Margaret clearly didn't know who she was dealing with. Sarah had faced down enemy forces and survived dangerous missions. She had commanded respect from some of the toughest people in the military. She was not going to be intimidated by a small-town tyrant with a clipboard. That afternoon, Sarah did some research online. She learned about HOA laws and homeowner rights. She discovered that many of Margaret's tactics were actually illegal. HOA presidents couldn't just make up rules whenever they wanted. They had to follow proper procedures and respect homeowners' rights. Sarah also learned that homeowners could sue HOAs for harassment and abuse of power. She started keeping detailed records of every interaction with Margaret. She saved all the letters and violation notices. She took pictures of her car's parking position and documented the times when she was fined for imaginary violations. Margaret seemed to sense that Sarah was not going to give in easily. She started escalating her tactics. She began walking by Sarah's house several times a day, always carrying her clipboard and camera. She took pictures of Sarah's car from every possible angle, looking for any excuse to issue another violation. One morning, Margaret knocked on Sarah's door at 7 a.m. When Sarah answered, Margaret handed her another violation notice. "What's this for now?" Sarah asked. "Excessive car washing," Margaret said. "You washed your car twice this week. That's creating unnecessary noise and water waste." Sarah stared at Margaret. "You're fining me for washing my car twice in 1 week?" "The HOA is committed to environmental responsibility," Margaret said. "Excessive car washing wastes water and creates runoff that can damage neighborhood drainage systems." Sarah had had enough. "Mrs. Henderson, this harassment stops now." "You're making up violations that don't exist. You're trying to force me to get rid of my car because you personally don't like it, but I'm not going anywhere, and neither is my car." Margaret's face turned red with anger. "We'll see about that. I have ways of dealing with difficult residents. You have no idea what I'm capable of." As Margaret walked away, Sarah realized that this situation was about to get much worse. Margaret was not going to give up, and she was clearly willing to do whatever it took to get her way. Sarah needed to be ready for whatever Margaret planned to do next. Margaret Henderson was running out of options. For 3 weeks, she had tried everything she could think of to force Sarah Mitchell to get rid of her Porsche. She had issued fake violations, made up new rules, and threatened legal action. But Sarah had not backed down. In fact, she seemed to be getting stronger and more determined with each confrontation. Margaret was not used to this kind of resistance. In 6 years as HOA president, she had successfully bullied dozens of residents into doing what she wanted. She had forced people to change their cars, repaint their houses, remove their decorations, and even move away completely. But Sarah was different. She was smart, confident, and completely unafraid. This made Margaret very angry. She felt like Sarah was challenging her authority and making her look weak in front of the other residents. Some neighbors were starting to ask questions about Margaret's behavior. A few had even suggested that maybe she was being too harsh with the new resident. Margaret knew she needed to do something dramatic to win this battle. She had to find a way to remove Sarah's car once and for all. That's when she remembered her cousin's boyfriend, Rick. Rick Peterson was 28 years old and worked as a security guard at a shopping mall. He was not very smart, but he was big and intimidating. He had always been willing to help Margaret with small favors in exchange for money. Margaret had used him before to scare residents who were causing her problems. Margaret called Rick and asked him to come to her house. When he arrived, she explained the situation with Sarah and her car. "I need your help with a problem neighbor," Margaret said. "She has a car that's causing issues in our neighborhood, but she won't listen to reason." Rick nodded. He had helped Margaret deal with problem neighbors before. Usually it involved knocking on their door and acting tough until they agreed to do what Margaret wanted. "What do you need me to do?" Rick asked. Margaret had been thinking about this for days. She had come up with a plan that she thought was brilliant. "I need you to pretend to be a federal officer. You're going to tell her that her car is illegally registered and needs to be confiscated." Rick looked confused. "A federal officer? I don't know anything about being a federal officer." Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "You don't need to know anything. I'll give you everything you need. I have a friend who works at a print shop. She can make official-looking documents and badges. You'll have everything you need to look legitimate." Rick was starting to feel uncomfortable. "I don't know, Margaret. Pretending to be a federal officer sounds illegal." Margaret laughed. "It's not illegal if it works. Besides, we're not really arresting anyone or stealing anything. We're just scaring her into giving up the car voluntarily." Once she hands over the keys, the car will disappear and our problem will be solved. But what if she calls the real police? Margaret had thought about this too. She won't call the police because she'll think you are the police. And even if she does get suspicious, you'll be long gone before anyone can check your story. Rick still wasn't sure about the plan. What happens to the car after I take it? Margaret smiled. That's the beauty of this plan. The car will be confiscated by federal authorities and never seen again. I happen to know someone who has a garage where it can be stored indefinitely. Rick realized that Margaret was planning to steal Sarah's car for herself. This made him even more nervous. Margaret, this sounds really dangerous. What if we get caught? Margaret's voice got harder. We won't get caught if you do your job right. Look, Rick, I've helped you out plenty of times. I got you that security guard job when no one else would hire you. I've loaned you money when you were broke. Now I need you to help me with this one thing. Rick felt trapped. Margaret was right that she had helped him in the past. He owed her favors, and she was not the kind of person who forgot when people owed her things. What exactly do you want me to do? He asked. Margaret pulled out a folder full of papers. I've been researching this for weeks. I found out that there really are federal vehicle compliance officers who deal with illegally imported cars. Most people don't know anything about them, so they won't question your authority. She showed Rick some official-looking documents she had found online. My friend at the print shop can copy these documents and make them look like they're about Sarah's car. We'll say that her Porsche was imported illegally and needs to be confiscated for investigation. Rick looked at the documents. They were full of legal language that he didn't understand. How am I supposed to know what to say when she asks questions? Margaret had prepared for this too. I've written a script for you. You'll memorize the basic facts, and if she asks detailed questions, you'll tell her that the information is classified or that she needs to contact your supervisor. She handed Rick a piece of paper with talking points written on it. The script explained that Sarah's car had been flagged by federal databases as potentially illegally imported. It said that the car needed to be immediately impounded for investigation, and that failure to cooperate would result in federal criminal charges. What if she asked to see my badge or ID? Rick asked. Margaret smiled. I'm having those made too. Professional-looking badge, official ID card, even business cards. You'll look completely legitimate. Rick read through the script several times. It sounded convincing, but he was still worried about getting in trouble. Margaret, if this goes wrong, we could both go to prison. Margaret's patience was running out. Rick, nothing is going to go wrong. This woman is just a regular person. She doesn't know anything about federal vehicle laws. She'll see your uniform and credentials. She'll read the official documents and she'll hand over her keys without question. But what if she's smarter than you think? Margaret laughed. Trust me, I've been dealing with her for weeks. She thinks she's tough, but she's just another homeowner who doesn't want trouble with the government. When you show up with federal authority, she'll cave immediately. Rick was still nervous, but he could see that Margaret had made up her mind. She was going to do this with or without his help, and if he didn't help her, she would probably make his life miserable in other ways. Okay, he said finally. I'll do it. But you have to promise me that if anything goes wrong, you'll take the blame. Margaret nodded quickly. Of course. If there are any problems, I'll tell everyone that you were just following my instructions. You'll be completely protected. Over the next few days, Margaret worked with her friend at the print shop to create Rick's fake credentials. They made an official-looking badge that said, Federal Vehicle Compliance Division. They created an ID card with Rick's picture and a fake government seal. They even made business cards and letterhead for a made-up federal agency. Margaret also bought Rick a uniform that looked like something a federal officer might wear. It was dark blue with patches and insignia that looked official from a distance. She coached him on how to stand, how to speak, and how to act like someone with authority. Remember, Margaret told him, confidence is everything. If you act like you belong there, she'll believe you belong there. Don't let her ask too many questions, and don't give her time to think about whether something seems wrong. Rick practiced his script until he could recite it without thinking. Margaret made him rehearse different scenarios and taught him how to respond to various questions that Sarah might ask. What if she wants to call my supervisor? Rick asked during one practice session. You tell her that your supervisor is in a meeting and that this matter is urgent. You explain that any delay could result in additional charges against her, Margaret replied. What if she wants to see a warrant? You tell her that federal vehicle compliance investigations don't require warrants. You explain that her car is considered evidence in a federal investigation and that she has no choice but to surrender it immediately. Margaret had thought of everything. She had created a complete fake identity for Rick and prepared him for every possible situation. She was confident that her plan would work perfectly. The only thing Margaret hadn't considered was the possibility that Sarah Mitchell might not be the ordinary homeowner she appeared to be. Margaret had no idea that Sarah was a trained military officer with years of experience dealing with officials, investigating suspicious behavior and spotting lies. Margaret was about to learn that she had chosen the wrong person to mess with. Tuesday morning started like any other day for Sarah Mitchell. She woke up at 6 a.m., made coffee, and sat on her back porch reading the news on her phone. The sun was shining and the neighborhood was quiet and peaceful. Sarah had no idea that Margaret Henderson's plan was about to unfold. At 9:30 a.m., Rick Peterson pulled up to Sarah's house in an old white sedan. He wore his fake federal officer uniform and carried a briefcase full of Margaret's forged documents. He had been practicing his script all morning, but his hands were still shaking as he walked up to Sarah's front door. Rick took a deep breath and knocked on the door. He could hear footsteps inside, and then the door opened. Sarah stood in the doorway wearing jeans and a t-shirt. She looked calm and relaxed, which made Rick feel a little more confident. "Good morning, ma'am," Rick said in his most official voice. "I'm Officer Peterson with the Federal Vehicle Compliance Division. I need to speak with you about your vehicle registration." Sarah looked at Rick carefully. Something immediately seemed off about him. His uniform looked real from a distance, but up close she could see that it was cheaply made. The patches and badges were slightly crooked, and the fabric looked like it came from a costume shop rather than a government supplier. "Federal Vehicle Compliance Division?" Sarah asked. "I've never heard of that agency." Rick had prepared for this question. "We're a specialized unit that deals with illegally imported vehicles. Most people haven't heard of us because we only get involved in specific cases." Sarah nodded, but she was already suspicious. In her 15 years in the Navy, she had worked with dozens of federal agencies. She knew how real federal officers dressed, spoke, and carried themselves. This man was trying too hard to sound official, and his nervousness was obvious. "Can I see your identification, please?" Sarah asked. Rick pulled out his fake ID card and badge. Margaret had done a good job creating them, but Sarah immediately noticed several problems. The government seal looked slightly wrong, the ID number format didn't match any federal agency she knew, and the card itself felt flimsy and cheap. "What exactly is the problem with my vehicle?" Sarah asked, handing the fake ID back to Rick. Rick opened his briefcase and pulled out the forged documents that Margaret had prepared. "According to our database, your Porsche may have been illegally imported. We need to impound it immediately for investigation." Sarah looked at the documents. They were impressive-looking papers with official letterhead and lots of legal language. But Sarah had read thousands of real government documents in her career, and these didn't look right either. The formatting was wrong, some of the legal terms were used incorrectly, and the signature at the bottom looked fake. "This is interesting," Sarah said, studying the papers more carefully. "Can you tell me your badge number and the contact information for your supervisor?" Rick felt his confidence starting to slip. Sarah was asking exactly the kinds of questions that Margaret had told him to avoid. "My badge number is, FVC 4429, and my supervisor is in meetings all day. This is an urgent matter that can't wait." Sarah memorized the fake badge number. "I see. And what federal law gives you the authority to confiscate vehicles without a warrant?" Rick was starting to sweat. Margaret had not prepared him for this level of questioning. "Federal vehicle compliance regulations give us broad authority to investigate suspected violations. Your cooperation is required by law." Sarah crossed her arms. "Which specific federal regulation? Can you cite the law you're referring to?" Rick's mind went blank. He couldn't remember anything from Margaret's script that would answer this question. The regulations are complex. I don't have time to explain all the legal details. I need you to hand over your keys immediately." Sarah's suspicions were now confirmed. This man was clearly not a real federal officer. Real agents would be able to cite the laws they were enforcing. They would have proper documentation and would know how to answer basic questions about their authority. "Officer Peterson," Sarah said calmly, "I think there's been some kind of mistake. Let me call the Federal Vehicle Compliance Division directly to confirm this investigation." Rick started to panic. "No, I mean, That's not necessary. I'm here to handle this matter personally. Calling our headquarters would just slow down the process. Sarah pulled out her phone. I insist. I want to make sure this is legitimate before I hand over my car to anyone. Rick knew that his fake agency didn't exist and that any phone call would expose the whole scheme. He decided to try a more aggressive approach, just like Margaret had taught him. Ma'am, you need to understand that this is a serious federal investigation. Refusing to cooperate with a federal officer is a crime. If you don't hand over your keys right now, I'll have to place you under arrest. Sarah almost smiled. This amateur was actually threatening to arrest her. She decided it was time to test his knowledge a little more. Under arrest for what specific federal crime? She asked. Rick was now completely lost. For, obstruction of a federal investigation, and for possession of an illegally imported vehicle. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I see, and you plan to arrest me by yourself? Don't federal officers usually work in pairs for safety reasons? Rick realized he was making mistakes, but he didn't know how to fix them. I'm specially trained to handle these situations alone. Now please give me your keys before this gets worse for you. Sarah could see that Rick was getting desperate and potentially dangerous. She decided it was time to end this charade. Officer Peterson, I need to get something from inside my house. Wait here for just a moment. Rick was relieved that Sarah seemed to be giving in. Make it quick. I don't have all day. Sarah went inside and closed the door. Rick waited outside, feeling proud that Margaret's plan was working. He thought Sarah was getting her car keys and would surrender the vehicle without any more problems. But Sarah was not getting her car keys. Instead, she was getting something that would change everything. She went to her bedroom and opened the drawer where she kept her military credentials. She pulled out her official Navy ID, her command insignia, and several other documents that proved her real identity and position. Sarah also grabbed her phone and quickly sent a text message to a contact in federal law enforcement. She wanted backup nearby in case this situation became dangerous. When Sarah returned to the front door, she was carrying a folder. Rick assumed it contained her vehicle registration and insurance papers. He had no idea that Sarah was about to reveal who she really was. Officer Peterson, Sarah said calmly, before I give you anything, I want to make sure I understand the situation correctly. You're claiming to be a federal officer with the authority to confiscate my vehicle. Is that right? Rick nodded confidently. That's correct. And you're required by federal law to comply with my instructions. Sarah opened her folder. Well then, I think you should know exactly who you're dealing with. She pulled out her military ID and command insignia. Rick's face went white as he realized what he was looking at. I am Commander Sarah Mitchell of the United States Navy, Sarah said in a voice that suddenly carried unmistakable authority. I have 15 years of experience working with real federal officers and real federal agencies, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that you are not who you claim to be. Rick's hands started shaking. This was not part of Margaret's plan. Margaret had told him that Sarah was just a regular homeowner who would be easily intimidated by fake federal authority. She had never mentioned that Sarah was a military officer. I don't know what you're talking about, Rick stammered. I'm a legitimate federal officer conducting a legitimate investigation. Sarah stepped closer to Rick, and her military training became obvious in the way she carried herself. No, you're not. You're an imposter who is committing several serious federal crimes right now. Impersonating a federal officer is a felony that carries up to 3 years in prison. Attempting to steal someone's vehicle using false credentials is another felony, and conspiracy to commit these crimes is yet another felony. Rick was now visibly terrified. He had thought this would be a simple intimidation job that would be over in a few minutes. He had never expected to be confronted by someone who actually knew federal law and could spot his fake credentials immediately. I think you should start telling me the truth, Sarah said. Who sent you here? Who made these fake documents? And what was the real plan for my car? Rick's resolve completely collapsed. Margaret had promised him that nothing would go wrong, but everything was going wrong. He was facing federal charges and potential prison time, and he knew that his only chance was to cooperate fully with the real authority standing in front of him. Rick Peterson stood on Sarah's front porch, sweating and shaking as he stared at her military credentials. Everything Margaret had told him was wrong. This woman was not an ordinary homeowner who would be easily scared. She was a trained military officer who knew exactly what real federal agents looked like and how they operated. Please, Rick said, his voice cracking. I can explain everything. Sarah kept her military bearing, standing straight and speaking in the calm, authoritative voice she had used to command sailors for 15 years. I'm listening, and I suggest you tell me the complete truth because lying to a federal officer is another crime you can add to your list. Rick's hands were shaking so badly that he dropped his briefcase. The fake documents scattered across Sarah's porch. I'm not really a federal officer, he admitted. Margaret Henderson paid me to pretend to be one. Sarah had suspected that Margaret was behind this scheme, but hearing Rick confirm it still made her angry. Margaret Henderson? The HOA president? Rick nodded miserably. She's been trying to get rid of your car for weeks. When her normal tactics didn't work, she came up with this plan. She said you would hand over your keys if you thought the federal government was demanding it. Sarah picked up one of the fake documents and examined it more closely. Where did these come from? Margaret had them made at a print shop. She has a friend who works there. They copied real federal documents and changed the details to make them about your car. Sarah was taking mental notes of everything Rick was telling her. This was clearly a well-planned conspiracy involving multiple people. What was supposed to happen to my car after you took it? Rick looked ashamed. Margaret said it would be stored in a garage where no one would ever find it. She said you would think the federal government had confiscated it, so you wouldn't report it stolen. But the car would actually belong to Margaret? Rick nodded. That was the plan. She said she deserved to have the car because you were causing problems in her neighborhood. Sarah felt her anger growing, but she kept her voice calm and professional. Rick, do you understand how serious this is? You just admitted to conspiracy to commit vehicle theft, impersonating a federal officer, and fraud. These are all federal felonies. Rick started crying. I know, I'm sorry. Margaret said nothing would go wrong. She said you would just give up the car and that would be the end of it. Sarah could see that Rick was genuinely scared and regretful. She decided to use this to get more information. Has Margaret done this kind of thing before? Not exactly like this, Rick said. But she's had me intimidate other neighbors who wouldn't do what she wanted. I've pretended to be a building inspector, a city code enforcement officer, and a utility worker. Margaret always has some scheme to pressure people into following her rules. Sarah was shocked. Margaret's behavior was even worse than she had thought. How many other residents has she done this to? Rick wiped his eyes. I don't know exactly. Maybe 8 or 10 families over the years. Margaret keeps a list of people she calls problem residents. She has different plans for dealing with each one. Sarah realized that Margaret had been running a criminal operation for years, using fear and fake authority to control her neighbors. Rick, I want you to understand something very clearly. You are in serious legal trouble right now. Your only chance of avoiding prison is to cooperate completely with the authorities. Rick nodded frantically. I'll do anything. I'll tell you everything. I just don't want to go to jail. Sarah pulled out her phone. I'm going to call the real federal authorities now. They're going to want to hear your story and they're going to want all the evidence of this conspiracy. Wait, Rick said desperately. What's going to happen to me? Sarah looked at him seriously. That depends on how helpful you are and how much you cooperate. If you tell the truth and help us build a case against Margaret, the prosecutor might consider reducing your charges. But if you lie or hold back information, you could face the full penalties for all these crimes. Rick thought about this for a moment. What if I give you everything? All the fake documents, Margaret's phone number, the address of the print shop, everything she told me to do. That would be a good start, Sarah said. But you'll also need to testify about Margaret's involvement and help the authorities understand how this whole operation worked. Rick made his decision. Okay, I'll do it. I'll tell you everything. Sarah called her contact in federal law enforcement. Within minutes, she had arranged for FBI agents to come to her house to interview Rick and collect evidence. She also called the local police to make sure they were aware of the situation. While they waited for the authorities to arrive, Sarah had Rick write down everything he could remember about Margaret's plans and instructions. She took pictures of all the fake documents and credentials. She also had Rick show her the text messages between him and Margaret that proved she had orchestrated the whole scheme. Rick, Sarah said as she reviewed his written statement, I want you to understand that you're doing the right thing now. Margaret put you in this position, but you have a chance to make it right by telling the truth. Rick nodded. I feel terrible about this. I never wanted to hurt anyone. Margaret said it was just a harmless prank to teach you a lesson. Sarah shook her head. There's nothing harmless about impersonating a federal officer or trying to steal someone's car. Margaret knew exactly what she was asking you to do, and she knew it was illegal. When the FBI agents arrived, Sarah showed them her military credentials and explained the situation. The agents were very interested in Rick's story and immediately began treating the case as a serious federal crime investigation. Agent Johnson, the lead investigator, interviewed Rick for 2 hours. Rick told them everything about Margaret's plan, including details about the fake documents, the print shop where they were made, and Margaret's history of using similar tactics against other neighbors. This is clearly a pattern of criminal behavior, Agent Johnson told Sarah. We'll need to investigate all of Margaret's previous schemes and interview the other residents she's targeted. Agent Martinez, the second investigator, examined all the fake documents and credentials. These are actually pretty sophisticated forgeries. Someone put a lot of time and effort into making them look authentic. Sarah provided the agents with copies of all the letters and violation notices that Margaret had sent her over the past few weeks. She also gave them her detailed notes about Margaret's harassment campaign. This shows a clear escalation pattern, Agent Johnson said. She started with minor harassment and kept escalating until she was willing to commit serious federal crimes. This woman is dangerous. The agents also interviewed Sarah about her military background and her experience with real federal officers. They wanted to make sure they understood how she had been able to spot Rick's fake credentials so quickly. Your training definitely saved you from becoming a victim, Agent Martinez said. Most civilians would have been fooled by this scheme, at least initially. After the interviews were complete, the agents arrested Rick and took him into custody. However, they made it clear that his cooperation would be noted in their report to the prosecutor. Rick, Agent Johnson said as they prepared to leave, you made some very bad decisions today, but you also made some good decisions by telling us the truth. That's going to help you in the long run. As the agents drove away with Rick, Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. She was glad that the immediate threat was over and that Rick was cooperating with the authorities. But she knew that Margaret was still out there, probably planning her next move. Sarah also realized that this case was much bigger than just her car and her personal conflict with Margaret. If Margaret had been running similar schemes for years, there were probably other victims who deserved justice. And if Margaret was willing to go this far to get her way, she might be dangerous in other ways too. Sarah decided to call Agent Johnson back. Agent Johnson, I want to make sure we get all the evidence we need to stop Margaret permanently. Should I be worried about her retaliating against me? Agent Johnson's voice was serious. Commander Mitchell, based on what we've learned today, I think Margaret Henderson is someone who escalates when she's cornered. I would recommend being very careful and reporting any contact from her immediately. Sarah understood. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was probably just beginning. Margaret Henderson was at home making lunch when she heard the doorbell ring. She looked out the window and saw 2 people in dark suits standing on her front porch. Her heart started beating faster. She had been expecting Rick to call her with news about successfully taking Sarah's car, but instead, strangers were at her door. Margaret opened the door with a smile, trying to look innocent and friendly. Good afternoon. Can I help you? The woman showed her a badge. Mrs. Henderson, I'm Agent Martinez with the FBI, and this is Agent Johnson. We need to speak with you about Rick Peterson and some activities involving your neighbor Sarah Mitchell. Margaret felt like the ground was falling out from under her. The FBI was at her door asking about Rick and Sarah. Something had gone terribly wrong with her plan. I'm sorry, Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. I don't know what you're talking about. Who is Rick Peterson? Agent Johnson looked at his notes. Mrs. Henderson, we have Mr. Peterson in custody. He's told us everything about the scheme you organized to impersonate a federal officer and steal your neighbor's car. Margaret's mind was racing. Rick had been caught and arrested. Even worse, he had apparently told the FBI everything. Margaret realized she was in serious trouble, but she decided to deny everything. That's ridiculous, Margaret said. I don't know anyone named Rick Peterson, and I certainly haven't tried to steal anyone's car. There must be some kind of mistake. Agent Martinez pulled out her phone and showed Margaret a picture of Rick. You're saying you don't know this man? Margaret looked at the picture and shook her head. I've never seen him before in my life. Agent Johnson made a note on his pad. That's interesting, Mrs. Henderson, because Mr. Peterson has provided us with detailed information about your relationship. He says you've been paying him to intimidate neighbors for several years. Margaret's face was getting red, but she continued to deny everything. That's completely untrue. I'm the president of this HOA, and I work very hard to maintain community standards. But I've never paid anyone to intimidate my neighbors. Agent Martinez looked around the neighborhood. We understand you've had some disputes with Mrs. Mitchell about her vehicle. Well, yes, Margaret admitted. I've had to issue some violation notices because her car doesn't fit the image we want for our community. But that's completely different from whatever this person is accusing me of. Agent Johnson nodded. Mrs. Henderson, we're going to need to search your house and look at your phone records and text messages. Do you consent to a search, or do we need to get a warrant? Margaret knew that refusing would make her look guilty, but she also knew that her house contained evidence of her schemes. Her computer had files about all the residents she had targeted. Her phone had text messages with Rick going back several months. I want to call my lawyer, Margaret said. That's your right, Agent Martinez said. But we're still going to search your house. We have enough evidence for a warrant. While they waited for the search warrant, more FBI agents arrived. Neighbors started coming out of their houses to see what was happening. Margaret could see people pointing at her house and talking to each other. She knew that by evening, everyone in the neighborhood would know that the FBI had searched her home. When the warrant arrived, the agents spent 3 hours going through Margaret's house. They found her computer files with detailed plans for harassing different neighbors. They found printed copies of fake government documents that she had used as templates. They found a notebook where she had written down the names and addresses of problem residents and her plans for dealing with each one. The most damaging evidence was on Margaret's phone. She had dozens of text messages with Rick discussing various schemes. The messages clearly showed that Margaret had planned the fake federal officer operation and had provided Rick with all the materials he needed. Agent Johnson showed Margaret some of the text messages. Mrs. Henderson, these messages are from your phone to Rick Peterson. In this one, you tell him to make sure she hands over the keys or else. In this other one, you discuss storing the car where no one will ever find it. How do you explain these messages? Margaret realized that denying everything was no longer possible. The evidence was too strong. She decided to try a different approach. Okay, maybe I did ask Rick to talk to Sarah about her car, Margaret said, but it wasn't supposed to be a real crime. I just wanted to scare her into being more reasonable about her vehicle choice. Agent Martinez shook her head. Mrs. Henderson, impersonating a federal officer is a serious felony regardless of your intentions, and attempting to steal someone's car is also a felony. I wasn't trying to steal her car, Margaret protested. I was just trying to get her to park it somewhere else or trade it for something more appropriate. Agent Johnson looked at more evidence they had found. We also discovered that you've been embezzling money from the HOA accounts. Our forensic accountants found irregular payments to yourself and unexplained expenses that don't match any legitimate HOA activities. Margaret's face went white. She had thought no one would ever discover her financial schemes. She had been taking small amounts of money from the HOA accounts for years to fund her harassment campaigns and to pay Rick for his services. That money was for legitimate HOA business. Margaret lied. Sometimes I had to advance my own money for community projects and then reimburse myself. Agent Martinez showed her bank records that the FBI had obtained. Mrs. Henderson, you've been taking money from HOA accounts and using it to pay for fake documents, Rick's services, and personal expenses. That's embezzlement, which is another felony. As the search continued, more evidence emerged. The agents found records showing that Margaret had filed false police reports against several neighbors over the years. She had called the police to report imaginary violations and had made up stories about residents who wouldn't follow her. Rules Agent Johnson interviewed some of Margaret's neighbors while the search was happening. Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Chen, and several other residents came forward with stories about Margaret's abuse of power. They told the agents about fake violations, harassment campaigns, and threats that Margaret had made over the years. She's been terrorizing this neighborhood for years, Mr. Johnson told the agents. People were afraid to stand up to her because she always found ways to make their lives miserable. Mrs. Chen showed the agents documentation of all the fake fines Margaret had issued to her family. She charged us hundreds of dollars for violations that didn't exist. When we complained, she threatened to put a lien on our house. The agents also discovered that Margaret had been running her HOA like a personal dictatorship. She had manipulated board elections, ignored proper procedures, and made up rules whenever it suited her purposes. By the end of the day, the evidence against Margaret was overwhelming. The agents had proof of conspiracy to impersonate a federal officer, attempted vehicle theft, embezzlement, filing false police reports, harassment, and abuse of power. Agent Martinez read Margaret her rights and placed her under arrest. Margaret Henderson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal crimes, embezzlement, and filing false police reports. As Margaret was being led away in handcuffs, her neighbors watched from their yards. Some looked shocked, but others looked relieved. After years of living under Margaret's tyrannical rule, they were finally free. The local news arrived just as Margaret was being put into the FBI car. The story of the HOA president who tried to steal her neighbor's car by using fake federal officers quickly spread throughout the city. Margaret became a symbol of HOA abuse and the dangers of giving too much power to petty tyrants. Sarah watched from her porch as Margaret was driven away. She felt satisfied that justice was being served, but she also felt sad that it had come to this. If Margaret had just followed the rules and treated her neighbors with respect, none of this would have happened. Agent Johnson approached Sarah before leaving. Commander Mitchell, thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. Your military training and quick thinking prevented a serious crime and helped us uncover a much larger pattern of criminal behavior. Sarah nodded. I'm just glad this is over and that Margaret won't be able to hurt anyone else. But Agent Johnson looked serious. This is actually just the beginning, Commander. Margaret will face trial and will need your testimony, and we're still investigating all of her other victims. This case could take months to fully resolve. Sarah understood. The legal process would be long and complicated. But at least Margaret was no longer in a position to terrorize her neighbors, and the other residents of Oakwood Estates were finally free from her abuse. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell sat in a federal courthouse listening to the judge read Margaret Henderson's sentence. The trial had taken 3 months, and the evidence against Margaret had been overwhelming. The jury had found her guilty on all charges. Margaret Henderson, the judge said, you have been found guilty of conspiracy to impersonate a federal officer, attempted vehicle theft, embezzlement, filing false police reports, and harassment. These crimes show a pattern of abuse of power that went on for years. Margaret sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jail uniform. Her expensive clothes and perfectly styled hair were gone. She looked much older and smaller than she had when she was terrorizing her neighbors. The court sentences you to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. The judge continued. You are also ordered to pay full restitution to all your victims, including the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. Margaret's lawyer had tried to argue that she was just an overzealous HOA president who had made some bad decisions. But the prosecutor had shown that Margaret's crimes were planned and deliberate. She had stolen thousands of dollars from the HOA, filed dozens of false police reports, and had systematically harassed residents who didn't follow her personal rules. Rick Peterson had received a much lighter sentence because of his cooperation. The judge had given him 1 year in prison and 2 years of probation. Rick had testified against Margaret and had helped the FBI understand how her schemes worked. Sarah had testified at the trial about the fake federal officer incident and about all the harassment she had received from Margaret. Her military credentials and calm, professional testimony had made a strong impression on the jury. Your Honor, Sarah had said during her testimony, Margaret Henderson didn't just target me. She created a climate of fear in our neighborhood. Residents were afraid to park the cars they wanted, plant the gardens they wanted, or live their lives the way they wanted, because they knew Margaret would find ways to punish them. The trial had also revealed the full scope of Margaret's crimes. Over 6 years as HOA president, she had stolen nearly $50,000 from association accounts. She had filed over 200 false police reports against neighbors she didn't like. She had issued thousands of dollars in fake fines for violations that didn't exist. 12 families had come forward to testify about Margaret's abuse. They told stories about being forced to change their cars, repaint their houses, remove decorations, and even move away to escape Margaret's harassment. Mr. Johnson had testified about how Margaret forced him to remove a small American flag from his front yard because she said it was too political. Mrs. Chen had described how Margaret fined her family for having flower pots that were the wrong color. Another neighbor had been forced to cut down a tree in his backyard because Margaret claimed it was blocking her view. The prosecutor had called Margaret a small-town dictator who used her position to bully and control her neighbors. The evidence showed that Margaret had seen the HOA as her personal kingdom, and any resident who challenged her authority became a target for her revenge. After the sentencing, Sarah walked out of the courthouse feeling relieved. The legal process had been long and stressful, but justice had been served. Margaret would spend the next 4 years in prison, and she would never be able to serve on an HOA board again. Agent Johnson met Sarah outside the courthouse. "Commander Mitchell, I want to thank you again for your role in this case. Your quick thinking and cooperation helped us stop a criminal who had been operating for years." Sarah shook his hand. "I'm just glad it's over. And I'm glad that Margaret's other victims finally got justice." The story of Margaret Henderson and her fake federal officer scheme had become famous throughout the region. Local news stations had covered the trial extensively, and the story had been shared thousands of times on social media. Margaret had become a symbol of HOA abuse and a cautionary tale about what happens when petty tyrants are given too much power. Back in Oakwood Estates, life had changed dramatically. The HOA had elected a new board of directors who were focused on actually improving the community, rather than controlling residents' personal choices. They had eliminated most of Margaret's made-up rules and had established clear procedures for handling violations. The new HOA president was Tom Williams, the neighbor who had complimented Sarah's Porsche on her first day in the neighborhood. Tom was a retired teacher who believed that HOAs should help residents, not harass them. "Our job is to maintain common areas and handle genuine problems," Tom told the residents at his first board meeting. "We're not here to tell people what color their flower pots should be, or what kind of cars they can drive." The new board had also implemented strict financial controls to prevent future embezzlement. All expenses had to be approved by multiple board members, and the association's finances were audited quarterly by an independent accountant. Sarah had become something of a neighborhood hero. Her neighbors appreciated how she had stood up to Margaret and had exposed the corruption that had been poisoning their community for years. Several neighbors had given her small gifts to thank her for her courage. Mr. Johnson had given Sarah a beautiful American flag for her front yard. "You deserve to fly this proudly," he had told her. "You served your country overseas, and then you served your community right here at home." Mrs. Chen had baked Sarah a cake with "Thank you, Commander" written in frosting. "You saved all of us from that woman," she had said. "We were too scared to fight her, but you weren't afraid." Sarah's Porsche still sat in her driveway every day, exactly where it had always been. She had never moved it to the garage or traded it for a different car. The car had become a symbol of resistance to bullying and a reminder that people shouldn't have to change their lives to satisfy neighborhood tyrants. The Porsche now had a small addition that made Sarah smile every time she saw it. The neighbors had chipped in to buy her a custom license plate that read "Freedom." It was their way of thanking her for freeing them from Margaret's tyranny. Sarah had also received recognition from her military superiors for her handling of the situation. Her commanding officer had written a letter of commendation noting that she had demonstrated exceptional judgment and leadership in a civilian law enforcement situation. The story had spread throughout the Navy as well. Sarah's fellow officers used it as an example of how military training could be valuable in civilian life. The incident had become a teaching case at the Naval Academy about recognizing fraud and standing up to authority figures who abuse their power. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from her new neighbors. The residents of Oakwood Estates had organized a community appreciation dinner in Sarah's honor. Nearly 50 people had attended to thank her for her courage and leadership. At the dinner, Tom Williams had made a speech. "Sarah Mitchell showed us that we don't have to accept bullying and abuse even when it comes from people in positions of authority. She taught us that standing up for what's right is always worth the effort, even when it's difficult or scary." Sarah had been deeply moved by the community's gratitude. "I just did what anyone should do when faced with injustice," she had said. "I couldn't stand by and watch while someone abused their power to hurt innocent people." As Sarah drove home from the courthouse after Margaret's sentencing, she reflected on everything that had happened. When she had first moved to Oakwood Estates, she had just wanted a quiet place to enjoy her retirement from active military service. She had never expected to find herself fighting a battle against corruption and abuse right in her own neighborhood. But the experience had taught her something important. The skills she had learned in the military, leadership, courage, attention to detail, and the ability to stand up to bullies, were just as valuable in civilian life. Even in retirement, she could still make a difference in her community. Sarah pulled into her driveway and looked at her house. It was exactly the peaceful home she had dreamed of when she bought it. The neighborhood was quiet and friendly. Her neighbors respected each other's choices and privacy. The HOA focused on genuine community improvement rather than petty control. Most importantly, Sarah's Porsche sat proudly in her driveway, gleaming in the afternoon sun. It was a reminder of how hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. It was also a symbol of freedom. The freedom to live your life on your own terms, without fear of bullies or tyrants. As Sarah walked to her front door, she noticed a small American flag flying in her front yard, right next to the flag that Mr. Johnson had given her. The two flags flew side by side in the gentle breeze, representing the values that Sarah had spent her career defending: freedom, justice, and the right of all people to live with dignity and respect. Margaret Henderson was in prison. Her victims had received justice, and Oakwood Estates was finally the peaceful community it was meant to be. Sarah Mitchell had won more than just a battle over a parking space. She had won a victory for everyone who had ever been bullied by someone in power, and had shown that sometimes standing up to a tyrant is the most important service you can provide to your community.